Every family has secrets, but occasionally a secret erupts into a court showstopper that alters lives. Such is the tale of Janelle Brown. Once the unobtrusive steady hand in a broken family, now the woman the judge stunned by awarding $4 million to her and seizing the home where Kody and Robyn resided. Justice? A few will say. About time, others mutter. But the whole truth lies between the raw testimony and the resounding gavel. Tonight, I'll take you through how small resentments became explosive legal strategy, how hallway whispers were preserved as recorded evidence, and how a judge's silent notebook became the most dangerous thing to Kody and Robyn. You'll listen to the secret texts, the sworn affidavits, and the secret moments that constructed an impossible case. You'll get to know Janelle, not as a headline, but as a human being, bruised, intent, and hazardous when provoked. This isn't just tabloid revenge. It's a slow burn of betrayal, legal cunning, and a final courtroom moment that felt like a storybook reversal. We'll unpack the timeline from the first hush call to the day the judge asked, "Where is the money?" and the room went silent. Expect shock, sympathy, and the uncomfortable question, how much of this victory is justice, and how much is survival? Before we get started, hit subscribe, because at the end of this hour I'll be asking you one tough question I want you to respond to in the comments. Who really came out on top at the end? Stay with me. The next bombshell is going to turn everything you think you know on its head. How does a peaceful breakup turn into a multi-million-dollar court landslide? It didn't begin with slammed doors and screaming fights. It started with quietness, the sort of quietness that seeps into a home where love slowly erodes, and obligations and forced grins move in to replace it. Janelle Brown had long been the reliable one in a family tempest. She was neither the loudest, nor the most dramatic, nor the one who craves the spotlight in front of cameras or neighbors. She maintained the calendars, coordinated the meals, juggled the pragmatic aspects of life, while everyone else appeared to pursue their own stories. To all outward appearances, she was contented, resigned even to a life of compromise. But quietly behind that facade, something was changing. At first, it was a sense that something was off. A payment made late when the account should have had more than enough. A payment sent without reason. Janelle picked up on the little things others dismissed as clerical errors. She didn't accuse right away. She watched, that was her specialty. She waited, she gathered, and she recalled. It was like tugging on a loose thread. Once you begin, the entire pattern starts to come undone. There was a night, one she would relive in her mind, when she had posed a straightforward question regarding costs. The reaction she had gotten wasn't anger, but dismissal. A flick of the wrist, a gruff excuse about tending to it, followed by a subject change. That moment stuck. It was like her worries didn't count, like she wasn't included in the discussion of the life she was living. It sowed the seed that something much greater was being kept under wraps. During the weeks that went by, she began to observe patterns. Receipts left behind in pockets, late-night calls answered outside, financial statements which didn't agree with what was being discussed at the dinner table. She started saving them quietly, secreting each piece into a hidden folder. She didn't even know what she was searching for, but she knew she couldn't turn a blind eye. That folder filled up, and every time she added something new, her suspicion firmed up into conviction. Money was being transferred, and it wasn't for the reason she'd been informed. It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal embedded in the lies. When someone hides things from you, when they minimize your questions, it isn't just about numbers. It's about trust, about control, about rewriting the story of a marriage while you're still living it. Janelle, who had always chosen patience over confrontation, now realized patience had turned her invisible. And invisibility was no longer an option. One evening, too awake to sleep, she opened her phone and browsed a series of text messages she'd taken quietly in screenshots. Words between individuals she trusted that revealed a different reality from the one she had been living. There was a mention of money promised, an undertaking to keep matters between us, and a scheme to redirect resources without telling her. Her hands shook as she reread them, not with shock, but with recognition. The truth was right in front of her, and now it was irrefutable. And from that point on, she knew the life she believed she had was gone. What was left was a decision: keep pretending or walk into the storm. Janelle walked into the storm. She started sorting through the folder in a way that resembled evidence, titling each section, affixing dates, copying it. Her quiet industriousness had become something honed, something unstoppered. It wasn't revenge she sought, not yet. It was clarity, and clarity would be confronted by whatever came next, no matter what it took to tear apart the house she'd spent decades struggling to keep together. Declining to go to an attorney with her folder wasn't dramatic. No melodrama music, no crying. It was a calm, calculated decision, the kind you make when you have been underestimated for too long. She entered the office, handed over the folder, and waited. The attorney sifted through the papers with increasing intensity, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing page. He finally raised his head and spoke. "Do you realize what you have here?" She nodded, serene but firm. She had been aware for weeks. That was when the private tempest turned into a public fight. The gentle woman with the steady finger was on the verge of taking the first move toward a courtroom that would determine not only her financial fate, but the heritage of a family whose reputation rested on cohesiveness. And in her file, lost between receipts and screenshots, was one wire transfer that would turn it all upside down, because the name on it was one nobody had anticipated seeing. One text, one transfer, and the timeline explodes. That wire transfer, lost among receipts and screenshots, was the weak point in the wall. When Janelle first caught sight of it, she thought it was an error. The figure was substantial, much greater than any usual expense, and the name of the recipient not one she would have anticipated seeing in conjunction with her family's resources. It was not a utility bill, a mortgage payment, or a tuition fee for a child. It was a name with more questions than answers. And questions were the one thing Janelle no longer shunned. When she handed the document to her attorney, his face told the story before his words did. He tapped the paper with his finger, leaned back, and said quietly, "This is where everything changes." For weeks, the folder had looked like suspicion stitched together with half-truths. But now, with one wire transfer, it looked like intent. Intent mattered in court. Intention implied that choices had been made in secret, decisions that had an immediate effect on Janelle's rights and future. From then on, all wheels started turning. The lawyer started constructing a timeline, setting out dates, figures, and transactions as pieces of a puzzle that was now finally coming together. Every transfer had been tied to an instant Janelle recalled distinctly: the time an argument had broken out, the time a bill had gone unpaid, the night she'd been dismissed with "don't worry about it." In an instant, the pieces of the puzzle no longer merely fit, they were telling a story. A story of money transferred intentionally, away from openness, away from her. The legal process started quietly: subpoenas, discovery requests, official letters. It wasn't sensational in the beginning, but underneath the serenity, tension was mounting. Each paper unraveled more, and with each new disclosure, the feeling of betrayal grew stronger. Individuals who felt secure on the sidelines were called upon to give testimony. Bank tellers, family acquaintances, even neighbors became a source for questions they never imagined themselves a part of. It was the text messages that started to draw the case into clear relief. However, screenshots that had previously been private frustrations on Janelle's phone now became evidence. Repayment promises, loose deals on transferring money, talks of keeping it on the down low, the type of mundane digital chatter that individuals never anticipate seeing again suddenly became undeniable proof. One message stood out. It was brief, nearly hasty: "It's better she doesn't know." 6 words, typed late at night, that weighed heavier than a whole testimony. For Janelle, seeing those words again under the cold glare of an attorney's office was catastrophic. She recalled the evening she'd first laid eyes on that message, her heart dropping, knowing without being told that she was being excluded from her own life. Now, in the framework of a court fight, those 6 words weren't only a wound, they were a sword. As the case progressed, depositions started, witnesses were summoned, told to sit down under oath and remember things. Some stalled, their voices trembling as they attempted to square the truth with obligation. Others spoke candidly, recounting financial maneuvers that coincided precisely with Janelle's suspicion. Every witness tightened the story. It was no longer simply Janelle's testimony versus anyone else's anymore. It was memory, supported by paperwork, compounded with digital evidence. I want you to imagine the scene when one of the witnesses, a reluctant family friend, pulled out a cell phone and played a stored voice memo. The room went silent. It wasn't yelling or rage in the recording, it was quiet, factual, near relaxed, and that's what made it so incriminating. It detailed a money-moving deal, set out in straightforward language, with no hope that anyone beyond that talk would ever learn about it. Now, everybody in that room did. Janelle sat motionless as it played, her expression unwavering, but within herself something changed. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about truth being pulled into the light, about tendencies of behavior that had existed in darkness too long. The lawyer leaned forward, pen in hand, and requested the witness to identify the voice on the tape. They nodded. That one nod shifted the entire weight of the case. It was no longer merely documents and suspicion. Now, it was sound, tone, the irretrievable cadence of a voice connected to decisions made in secret. From that day forward, the case took on a new sense of urgency. The defense was no longer able to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial or hyperbolic. Too much detail, too much congruence between words, numbers, and lived experience. The timeline wasn't broken anymore. It was complete, whole, and deeply damning. For Janelle, it was heartache enveloped in vindication. Every new discovery confirmed her suspicions, but also reminded her that the life she'd believed she'd never actually existed. What she had thought were just tiny mistakes or miscommunications were choices. Choices made intentionally, choices made without her. And just when the room believed they had heard the most incriminating piece of evidence, something unusual occurred. Once the voice memo had been played, the defense attorney asked for a recess. He proceeded to the judge, spoke in a hushed tone, and within a matter of minutes, the judge instructed certain records to be sealed for the time being. The whole room hummed with queries. What was so sensitive, so perilous, that it had to be concealed even now? The answer would arrive eventually, and when it arrived, it would not merely vindicate Janelle's claim. It would incinerate the courtroom. When sworn testimony meets private recordings, truth becomes loud. That voice memo upended everything. Up until that moment, the defense had rested on the claim that all this was hyperbole, that Janelle had taken numbers out of context, distorted meanings, or taken snippets out of context. But a tape is not biased. Selective memory. It just sits there, immovable, waiting to be replayed and replayed. And when the judge listened to the clear, measured voice describing how cash would be transferred so she won't notice, it was as if the air in the room grew thick. Janelle sat silently, while the memo rang out from the tiny speakers. She didn't blink. She didn't have to. The proof spoke more volumes than she ever could. The judge leaned in a little, pen poised over his notepad, an indicator that what he just heard counted. The lawyers rustled papers, adjusting strategies on the fly. For the first time, the story wasn't dictated by testimony. It was fixed by evidence that couldn't be spun around. It was all methodical after that. The prosecution started stringing out the contents, pairing transactions and texts, texts and calls, and this newly emerged recording. It was threading beads onto a piece of string. Individually, they appeared insignificant, but collectively, they created a chain too powerful to be disregarded. A transfer that had previously appeared as a one-time slip suddenly fit hand in glove with a date mentioned on the memo. A late-night text regarding getting to it tomorrow coincided with another unexplained withdrawal. Patterns developed, irrefutable, unavoidable. Witnesses who had previously appeared peripheral, a bank worker, a family friend, even a neighbor, were suddenly critical. The bank worker validated timestamps, aligning them with the timeline of the memo. The acquaintance confessed they had been privy to conversations that now perfectly aligned word for word with what the recording demonstrated. And the neighbor, sheepishly, recounted witnessing boxes being stacked into a car on the same night funds had disappeared from an account. Individually, none of these individuals could bear the case. But collectively, their accounts stacked into a tower that towered over the defense. For Janelle, It was like a dream. She recalled all those nights lying awake, wondering if she was losing her mind, if she was hallucinating. Now listening to strangers verify information she had lived through, she knew that she had been correct all along. The betrayal hadn't been imaginary. It was actual, and now it was irrefutable. The defense attempted to fight back. They claimed the recording was out of context, that it was a part of a longer conversation that was altered by meaning. They claimed the witnesses were confused, that memories fade with time. But each time they attempted to disqualify one, the prosecution would simply produce another, a receipt, a screenshot, a message. The evidence was overwhelming. And then suddenly came the surprise turn of events no one had expected. Under a blistering cross-examination, a witness dropped a bombshell. There was a property deed. The deed had been signed, recorded, and forgotten. At least forgotten by those who hoped it stayed that way. But halfway through testifying, the witness conceded that the deed looked a little suspicious. A signature was incorrect, a line was missing, a detail was off. At first it seemed like a small clerical problem, but in a courtroom, small errors can be used as weapons. The prosecution jumped on it right away. They asked for the original deed, not a reproduction, and when produced, the discrepancy was evident. A line that was supposed to convey ownership had been left out, and that gap provided a doorway large enough for the whole case to pass through. If the deed had been defective, if it was tampered with or filed negligently, then questions of ownership, transfer, and intent all became legitimate game. You could sense a change in the courtroom. Confidence of the defense wavered. The judge's focus became more acute. And Janelle, sitting demurely, realized that what started as a hunch regarding missing money now had become something much bigger. A case not only of money, but of property, assets, and the integrity of the entire domestic edifice. In that instant, everything escalated. This wasn't just about showing secret transfers anymore. This was about showing deceit on a scale that could destroy years of skillfully crafted illusions. The defense requested time, rushing to get explanations ready. The prosecution pushed harder, smelling vulnerability. And the judge, while composed, now had in his possession evidence that cried out for answers. To the gallery viewers, it was a show. To Janelle, it was vindication and heartbreak. Each bit of evidence validated her suspicions, but everyone dismantled the image of the family she had worked so long to shield. And as the court recessed for the day, the question that went unasked still hung in the air like static. If one act of paperwork could leave something so egregious out, what else was missing from the documents? The answer would come next session, and the answers would be more dynamite than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. Where documents speak, silence is not possible. The next day, the courtroom vibrated with a silent pressure. Everyone was aware that the deed to the property was the new focal point, the line that could potentially unravel the whole thing. Janelle leaned forward in her chair, eyes glued to the pile of files being brought to the judge's bench. The air was thicker, as if each individual in the room knew the tide was changing. The prosecution did not dawdle. They called to the stand an expert witness, a handwriting and document examiner who had spent decades taking apart the legitimacy of signatures and documents. The analyst testified calmly, nearly clinically, as blown-up images of the signature of the deed flashed across a screen. Holding a pointer, they outlined each bend and angle, drawing parallels with confirmed examples. The variations weren't sensational to the naked eye, but once pointed out, they were impossible to ignore. A hesitation mark, an awkward lift, a mismatch in ink pressure. Each one in isolation wasn't problematic, but collectively, they painted the picture of forgery. The defense jumped in at once, claiming it was a clerical error or a careless variation, but the analysts stood firm. This signature, they said, was not written in the same hand, and based upon the flow, I would have to say it was deliberately imitated. That one word, deliberately, fell with the force of a hammer blow. The courtroom leaned forward. If the signature was forged, then ownership was in doubt. And if ownership was in doubt, then each transfer, each fiscal action related to that property could be suspect. What had started out as a family squabble now hung in the balance of fraud allegations. Janelle's heart raced. She recalled the day that the deed was signed, or more accurately, the day that she was informed it had been signed. She hadn't been there. she hadn't been asked. In those moments, she dismissed it as one of those things families with messy setups just get through. But now, understanding that her omission was not an oversight but a deliberate plan, the pressure of betrayal bore down. The judge pushed back in his chair, fingers interlaced, considering. He did not utter a word immediately, but his silence was deafening. It was clear to all in the room, the case had gone beyond. It was no longer about missing funds or inadequate accounting. It was about intent, manipulation, and deception on a high level. The defense resorted to scrambling. They called in their own expert, who attempted to explain the inconsistencies by suggesting natural variation. But the more they argued, the more it fell apart. The prosecution then brought in timelines that indicated when the deed had been filed, conveniently during a time when certain key family members were out of town. They highlighted emails, innocuous looking on the surface, that somehow appeared suspicious when set against the date of filing of the deed. A picture was emerging, each piece of the puzzle fitting snugly into place. And Janelle's own quiet but ruinous testimony. She spoke of when she found out the deed wasn't what she believed. Her voice wasn't shaking, but it had a keen edge of definition. I wasn't there, I wasn't informed, I was just supposed to take it as truth. The very plainness of what she said made it more effective. She didn't require drama. The betrayal itself was drama enough. Her words elicited gasps from the crowd. They shifted uncomfortably in seats, their faces whispering, their heads shaking, because now it wasn't just about technicalities in the law anymore. It was about trust, the very cornerstone. Every relationship, every contract, every familial setup hinges on. And once lost, no deed or ink can mend. The judge at last uttered a word. He put the deed in abeyance, its validity on hold until further study. At that instant, the defense sacrificed more than turf. They lost integrity. Janelle looked over at the other table. The confidence was the first to go there, replaced by tension and barely suppressed panic. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, but within her something was shifting. The truth, long buried, was fighting its way into the light. As the court recessed, journalists scrambled out to write their headings. Words of forgery, fraud, and deception rang through the corridors. And although there was no verdict, the tale was already changed. For now the world wished to know if one deed had been forged, how many others had been fiddled with, and what other secrets lay in waiting. The response was arriving, and it would be much more sinister than anyone had anticipated. Every fight comes to the juncture where whispers become roars. When the courtroom doors opened again, the atmosphere was new. Journalists packed together shoulder to shoulder, cameras held high, pens scribbling every change of expression. The deed forgery revelation had transformed a low-key legal battle into a circus. Everyone was eager to find out what happened next. And for the first time, Kody and Robyn were less a united front and more a couple trapped by the very narrative they had attempted to manipulate. Janelle walked in quietly, but her gaze revealed the tempest inside her. She was no longer fighting for property or money. She was fighting for acknowledgement, for justice, for each time her voice had been muffled. Years accumulated on her shoulders, yet she bore them with reserve. The prosecution began with a timeline. It wasn't flashy, but it was crushing. They presented financial transactions directly linked to the contentious property, leading them back to shared accounts Kody and Robyn had access to. They contrasted dates when funds went out with the times when other family members were not in the loop. The figures spoke of secrecy, a sequence that wasn't by chance. Every slide on the projector cinched the noose. Robyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her lips pursed, her eyes flicking toward Kody as if calling silently for him to bail them out. But Kody's jaw was set, his stance tense. For a man who lived on control, he seemed astonishingly helpless. Then, a bombshell. The prosecution produced a series of taped phone calls, presented as evidence. The room fell silent as the first clip was played. The words were muted, but identifiable. The measured tone of Robyn, the snappish responses of Kody. They weren't confessions of guilt per se, but the implication was damning. They used words like keeping quiet, not letting Janelle rock the boat, and getting the papers done before people ask questions. Each of these phrases hung in the air like a challenge, drawing the jury further into suspicion. Janelle's lawyer jumped on the opportunity, showing how those calls, combined with the suspicious deed, were a picture of exclusion and manipulation. This wasn't about one error. This was about intent. The defense outburst at this point accused the prosecution of misrepresenting words, of mangling private talk out of context. But it was too late. For the jury, for the public, for anyone witnessing this narrative play out, the credibility of Kody and Robyn was beginning to break. In that instant, Janelle didn't have to say anything. Her silence was louder than any evidence. She remained firm, her eyes straight ahead, as if saying to the room, "You see now, you finally see." But the day wasn't over yet. Closing arguments were requested by the judge before recess, and Janelle's lawyer spoke in words that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. "This isn't about property lines or digits on a bank statement," he said. "It is about betrayal among family members, about decisions made in darkness that now stand in light. When trust has been broken, what do you have? Justice. And that is why we stand here today." The words resonated, ringing in the quiet room, for the gallery, for the press. It was the kind of statement that would be tomorrow's banner. For Janelle, it was the truth she had spent years waiting to hear in words. As the gavel came down and the proceedings adjourned, pandemonium broke outside. Cameras clicked, questions hurled, microphones thrust towards anyone who would mouth a word. But over the din, one question continued to revolve. If the case was this airtight, what would the judge's verdict be? And most importantly, what would be the implication for Kody and Robyn, who now teetered on the edge of losing not only assets, but face, home, and the carefully built face they had battled to save? The response wasn't forthcoming yet, but everybody knew. When it came, it would be seismic to the family's core. And secretly, Janelle understood that the battle had just started. Any storm leaves debris in its wake, and occasionally the debris is louder than the storm itself. The steps of the courthouse had never been so chaotic. Journalists huddled together like birds around carrion, cameras shooting wildly as Kody and Robyn attempted to hide from the hail of questions. "Did you forge documents?" one yelled. "Are you afraid of losing your home?" another asked. The more they avoided, the more those voices grew, until Robyn's tense smile broke, and she grumbled something under her breath that was immediately picked up by a microphone. In a matter of minutes, it was on social media, analyzed, replayed, and criticized. Janelle didn't descend those stairs to cheers. She glided quietly, almost purposefully, her countenance serene. But her silence had been read as strength. And when a reporter yelled, "Do you feel vindicated?" she waited, just long enough to have her eyes scan the room and said, "I feel seen." 2 words, and suddenly the narrative changed once more. Those words were headlines, tweets, and trending posts. Since in a case involving money and property, Janelle had reminded them all, it was also about dignity, about being neglected until the truth insisted on notice. In their car, Kody's fingers wrapped around the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles paled. Robyn attempted to say something, but he interrupted her harshly. Fury seethed in him, not only at Janelle, but at the disintegrating control he had once had so effortlessly. He had constructed his existence on the assurance that he could control everything. His wives, his public persona, his money. And now all of it was draining from his grasp, and the paparazzi outside were capturing every moment of it. That evening, the tale dominated all news cycles. Talk shows filled with experts debating the case, surmising fraud, about faked deeds, about prison cells awaiting if the charges became more solid. Family friends spoke in hushed interviews, some of them supporting Kody and Robyn, others of long smoldering resentments. And throughout, one name continued to surface: Janelle. For years she'd been the quiet one, the practical one, the one who bore her burdens in silence. Now her strength had made her the embodiment of resistance. Viewers nationwide weren't simply observing a trial. They were observing a woman reclaiming her voice against those who had discounted her. And every news medium knew. The public adored a redemption arc. Nevertheless, behind the toughness, Janelle carried uncertainty. Court cases are not won until the gavel comes down, and she knew the defense would battle with all means available to them. But for the very first time, she sensed momentum her way. Her lawyer reassured her. Her kids stood behind her. and strangers wrote letters of encouragement. She wasn't standing up for herself alone. She'd unknowingly become a symbol for everyone who'd ever been pushed to the sidelines. Meanwhile, within Kody and Robyn's own home, the mood turned dark. Their formerly carefully constructed world was disintegrating. Disagreements spilled into midnight whispers, their voices rising and falling behind locked doors. The tension no longer remained concealed. Robyn, who was once regarded as the stoic tactician, was tired, her eyes hiding sleepless nights. Kody paced rather than sat, his temper igniting at trifling things, his fear bursting out in anger. The house itself appeared to reverberate with tension. It had once been a refuge, but now it had become a prison suffocating. And the irony was biting. This was the same house at the center of the controversy, the same property whose validity was being torn apart before their very eyes. In court again, rumors of the next stage rippled through. More evidence was to be presented, more witnesses coming forward, every step guaranteed to strip away another layer, to see if this was a singular act or one within a greater pattern. And as Janelle prepared herself for what was ahead, the audience, the press, even the jurors, all knew it. The actual bombshells hadn't even been dropped yet. The question hung in the air like smoke after a blaze. If the first cracks were so destructive, what would the consequences be when the whole wall collapsed? Each court has its breaking point, and on this day, the silence burst wide open. As soon as the judge walked in, the tension was strained. Nobody shifted inadvertently. Nobody spoke softly. It was as if each chair, each desk, each shade of darkness in that room was aware that something irrevocable was to occur. Janelle sat unmoving, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge. She didn't need to play the hero. The truth was her partner now. The prosecution did not dawdle. They brought in a financial investigator, a quiet-spoken man with a reputation for unwinding tangled threads of secret accounts and transfers. He moved confidently, his bulging binder of files a warning to the defense. When he testified, he was economical with words, but they struck with precision. He explained how money had been transferred over the years, usually by way of joint accounts over which Kody and Robyn had sole control. He spoke of deposits mysteriously appearing, withdrawals made suspiciously close to the time of filing the deed, and payments with no discernible motive. The figures didn't deceive. They collectively spoke not of laxity, but of meticulous planning. Robyn shifted uncomfortably, fingers twisting the cuff of her sleeve. Kody sat back, arms folded, his eyes fixed on the investigator with a scowl hard enough to cut. But each fresh chart flashed on the screen eroded their ground. Each line tracing one account into another colored them into a corner. Then the turning point. The investigator uncovered a transfer that directly linked the controversial property to an account bearing Robyn's name. It wasn't big in relation to the millions involved, but it was sufficient. A string linking her directly into the money trail. Gasps spread through the gallery. Robyn had attempted for weeks to project the image of being caught in the middle, of simply standing behind her husband, but the paper indicated otherwise. The defense sprang to their feet, objecting wildly, arguing the story was shared, that the label was deceiving. But the damage was done. The eyes of the jury rested longer on Robyn than they had previously, their pens harder on their notepads. Janelle's lawyer took advantage of the opportunity. This isn't coincidence, they declared bluntly. This is about a pattern, a calculated pattern of exclusion, manipulation and gain, at the cost of those who have trusted them most. The words lingered, like knives. Kody had had enough. For weeks he had listened to the accusations, the whispers, the veiled jabs at his integrity. But now, before the jury, before the judge, he sprang forward and snarled. This is absurd. You think I'm a mastermind of some sort? I built this family. I supported. And now I'm being destroyed for it. His voice boomed in the chamber, but the outburst only plunged the silence that followed. The judge's gavel came down hard, ordering order, but the harm had been inflicted. Jurors looked on, not with sympathy, but with discomfort. For the first time, Kody's rage wasn't overpowering, it was desperate. Janelle didn't blink. She just gazed at him, her face unflinching, as if she were seeing him for the first time without the filter of authority he'd always worn. And in the quiet, the contrast was striking. His fury against her serenity, his disintegration against her strength. The judge adjourned for the day, but tension did not release with the bang of the gavel. It accompanied all of them out of the courtroom, a spectral presence. It clapped in reporters' ears as they rushed to seize Kody's outburst. Their newspaper headings already launched. Kody blows up under stress. Robyn's finances in question. Undefined. For those watching from the start, it was obvious the course had changed forever. Because once a leader loses the room, it's only a matter of time until he loses everything else. With every heightening of tension comes a subdued reckoning, and Janelle's reckoning was not in chaos, but in contemplation. That night, once the courtroom cleared, and the hum of reporters disappeared into the evening, Janelle sat alone in her living room. There was near silence. For weeks her days had been a cacophony of sound, lawyers, reporters, whispers in the gallery, even ringing echoes of Kody's rage. But tonight, for the first time, there was silence. She sat with it, feeling the intensity of what had transpired. She considered the years attempting to build a family, of bending until she almost snapped, of hearing assurances that never came, of seeing trust erode piece by piece, until all that was left was duty. She considered the countless times she'd selected peace over conflict, silence over disagreement, because it was simpler than the tempest that accompanied opposition. And now, bathed in the warm light of a lamp, she understood that all those decisions had brought her to this point, to a war she never wanted, but was no longer able to escape. Her phone buzzed with messages. Friends, children, even distant relatives reached out. Some offered encouragement, others asked questions. But one message stood out. It was from her daughter. A simple line, "Mom, I'm proud of you." Janelle read it twice, her eyes stinging. She had always wanted to protect her children from the worst of the family struggles. Yet here they were, watching her stand her ground. And instead of pity, they gave her pride. At the same time in town, Kody and Robyn's house was thick with a completely different sort of silence. Their kids stayed to themselves, picking up on the tension that permeated each nook of the house. Robyn hunched over the kitchen table, her head in her hands, the pressure of public judgment bearing down heavier than she had ever thought possible. Kody walked back and forth down the hallway, phone clamped to his ear, as he raved to whomever would hear him. Advisors, attorneys, even old buddies. But the calls all ended the same, in frustration, in unresolved questions, in shut doors. For the first time, the fortress they had constructed around themselves was tenuous. The secrecy walls, and the control walls, the crafted narrative, all of them were cracking. And the world outside wasn't merely watching, it was judging. At home again, Janelle's lawyer phoned with news. Additional papers had emerged, records that would make their argument even more solid. Janelle listened intently, her head nodding though no one was there to notice. With each additional piece of evidence, they were one step further along, but it also meant the battle wasn't anywhere near concluded. She hung up the receiver and let out a deep breath, calming herself. She knew the toughest part was still to come, not the testimony, not the drama of the courtroom, but the cost to his heart. Taking on Kody wasn't about legal rights. It was about standing up to the man who had been at the center of her universe, the father of her children, the partner she had trusted. To stand against him was to finally believe that the man she once loved was gone, and that truth, honed finer than any cross-examination, cut deepest. The night dragged on. Outside, the world speculated, argued, took sides. Inside, Janelle remained silent, her determination growing with each passing moment. She wasn't fighting revenge, even though the tabloids framed it that way. She was fighting for justice, for the principle that trust must never be taken advantage of, not by strangers, and definitely not by family. By dawn her head was clear. The fight that awaited her would be longer, louder, and tougher than what had already gone on. But she was ready. The woman who had once thought of choosing silence had discovered her voice, and she was not about to give it away. And despite the looming next court date, the true question wasn't whether Janelle would survive. It was whether Kody and Robyn would survive the revelations still to come. Because the more the court delved, the more sinister the shadows appeared to deepen. Each courtroom saga has one day that is heavier than all the others. the sort of day when everybody turns up knowing something is about to be decided. That morning, the corridors outside the courtroom were filled more tightly than ever before. Journalists shouldered in, cameras clicked, and murmurs hummed like white noise. Even hardened court officials sensed the change. This was not another hearing. Something was on the way, something that could tip the entire case one way or another. Within, the judge's chair towered over the space like an unspoken sign of authority. Janelle remained seated at her table, rock steady. Her lawyer fumbled papers with unobtrusive assurance, his motions economical. In the aisle across from her, Kody fidgeted. He drummed on the table, spoke in whispers to his lawyer, looked over at Robyn with eyes that bore both anger and terror. Robyn didn't look at him, gazed instead at her hands, as if she might find the answers within her palms. The prosecution stood up first, holding a new folder, its corners creased from being touched. The room leaned forward as the lawyer began. Your Honor, we have recently received evidence which gets to the very root of this controversy. And with that, the documents were passed over. The judge did not react, but his brow furrowed ever so slightly as he read the first page. The evidence was simple, but devastating. Internal emails, subpoenaed from a third-party firm involved in filing property paperwork, revealed clear instructions from Robyn's account. The wording was cautious, but not cautious enough. Lines like, ensure this is filed discreetly, and avoid unnecessary signatures that could delay the process, painted a picture of someone not merely involved, but directing the shadows. Gasps were murmured quietly across the gallery. Robyn's complexion paled. For weeks she had carried the picture of standing alongside Kody, a partner swept up in forces beyond her control. Now the paper trail bound her inextricably into the machinery of exclusion. The defense jumped in to protest, accusing the emails of being too vague, and claiming they might be taken out of context. But the prosecution was quick to respond, citing timing, wording, and how they coincided with the financial transfers already revealed. Piece by piece, the puzzle was fitting together. Janelle's eyes flashed with a subdued combination of vindication and despair. She had never wanted it to end this way, watching her former family being pulled into public shame. But she also knew that without the truth, there would be no justice. She sat up straighter, giving herself one steady breath, as the documents were read. Kody's patience finally snapped once more. He thumped his hand on the table, his voice rising. This is a witch hunt. You can spin numbers, you can twist words, but you don't know the truth of this family. His voice cracked, not with conviction but with desperation. The judge's gavel came down hard, calling for silence, but the outburst had already betrayed him. Jurors gave each other nervous glances. To them, anger wasn't evidence. It was a mask slipping. Robyn, though, did not move. She was still so still she seemed unnatural. She said nothing, protested nothing, even denied nothing when she read it. And in the silence, the lack of defense from her cried louder than Kody's anger. When the judge finally spoke to the court, his voice was subdued, yet his words were heavy. This case is no longer a mere civil dispute over contested property. Evidence introduced brings into play serious issues of intent and legality. To that end, further inquiry will reach beyond this courtroom. The room exploded. Journalists wrote madly, some rushing out into the hallway to send breaking reports. The words "extend beyond this courtroom" echoed in every ear. It was a warning that what started as a battle over money and homes now balanced on the precipice of criminality. Janelle kept quiet, yet her heart pounded. She hadn't anticipated the judge making that line today, but he had. The stakes were higher than anyone had predicted. When court recessed, Kody marched out, face flushed, jaw clenched, pushing aside cameras with brusque dismissal. Robyn followed him, her silence more oppressive than any denial. And the questions circled like wildfire in every headline, every dinner table, every late-night discussion. If this battle could lead to criminal investigations, what's next? The solution was nearer than anyone could have imagined, and it would upend everything. The last day arrived with clouds so dense it seemed as though the world itself was not breathing. Outside the courthouse, there were twice as many people as before. Journalists elbowed for space, satellite trucks up and down the block, and viewers of the show held hand-lettered signs, as if this were the season finale of a show they could not possibly miss. Within, the air was stretched, nearly metallic. Every bench was occupied, every juror in place, every gaze focused on the bench upon which the judge stood to utter words that would resound far beyond the confines of this courtroom. Janelle sat still, but her calm concealed the whirlwind of feelings within her. For months, she had tolerated late nights, cross-examination, accusations and betrayals. But now, she was just seconds away from knowing if it was all worth it. Her lawyer gave her a reassuring nod, muttering, "We've done all we can, trust the process." Kody meanwhile was a knot of raw nerves. His jaw flexed and unflexed, his fingers beat the table in agony, and his gaze flicked between the judge and the audience, as though desperate to find an exit. Robyn sat next to him, white and receded, her fingers white-knuckled on the arm of her chair. Her poise in previous hearings was forgotten now. Evidence had gouged too deep. The judge raised a pile of documents, his glasses slipping down over the end of his nose. The courtroom fell silent. When he did speak, his voice had the sort of weight that quieted even the most fidgety onlookers. With attentive consideration of the evidence submitted, he started. This court holds compelling evidence that Mrs. Janelle Brown was illegally denied her rightful portion of marital property by willful acts of concealment and misappropriation on the part of Mr. Kody Brown and Mrs. Robyn Brown. A ripple ran through the gallery. Whispers, gasps, the sound of muffled keyboard clicks. Janelle took a sharp breath, her gaze locked on the judge, as if in fear of blinking. The judge went on. Furthermore, this court grants Mrs. Brown monetary damages for $4 million, to be taken from communally owned assets and liquidated funds. Kody's head jerked toward the bench. His lips parted, but nothing emerged. For the first time, the man who had constructed his persona on authority, on being invincible, seemed small, trapped. The blow, however, was not over yet. The judge's next sentence fell like thunder. Furthermore, the property at Flagstaff, owned now by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, is seized and turned over for liquidation to enforce judgment. Possession must stop within 30 days. The courtroom burst into bedlam. Reporters stood up en masse, some racing for the door to call in the headline-making news. Judge seizes Kody and Robyn's home. Cameras in front of the courthouse popped like firecrackers. At the defense table, Robyn's hand slid off the arm of the chair, her shoulders hunching in as if her spine had been crushed by the weight of the verdict. Tears rose, but she clamped them back, too shocked to let them flow. Kody, though, could not hold himself back. He leapt to his feet, his voice cracking with anger. "This is outrageous. You can't steal my house. You can't." The judge's gavel came down with a strength that rattled the wood underneath it. "You will show respect to this court, Mr. Brown. Sit down." Kody stood there, defiance in his eyes, but nowhere else to put it. Gradually he sat back down again, although his body was shaking with suppressed anger. Across the aisle, Janelle finally breathed. Not a victorious smile, not a loud shout, just a soft sigh of air, like something that had rested on her chest all those years had finally been removed. Her lawyer put his hand on top of hers. "It's done," he whispered. And although Janelle understood the cameras would turn this into headlines, although she knew that Kody and Robyn would fight in interviews and on appeals, none of it was important in this moment. All that mattered was that justice, after all these years of being withheld, had finally been done. The judge slammed his gavel down a final time. "This court is adjourned." The room erupted again, reporters surging like a tide toward the doors, while spectators murmured, some stunned, some satisfied. As the courtroom cleared, Janelle stood. She moved with slow, deliberate strides, not daring to look at Kody or Robyn. The world beyond beckoned her. Flashing lights, outstretched microphones, strangers calling her name. But within, it was silence. She had won not merely money, not merely possessions, but confirmation that the truth had at last been acknowledged. Behind her, Kody sat slumped in his chair, head buried in his hands, Robyn quietly to his right. Their empire, so painstakingly constructed, now was in shambles. And as Janelle stepped through the courtroom doors into the din of cameras and burst of sunlight, the tale of sister wives had arrived at a chapter that no one could have foreseen, one in which the reserved wife who once lingered in the background now stepped out with the ultimate triumph.